Welcome back, students. Now we're going to go ahead and cover the vertebral column. There are some key general structures that you need to know for all the vertebra. It's just finding those bony landmarks, the specific ones. And we're going to go pretty much straight down the checklist for you. Now the first term is going to be your superior articular facet. These are the bony landmarks in which they are going to rub against one another or create joints, so to speak. Now the best way to truly look at these first and foremost is to actually have a spinal column all aligned with all the bones intact, and we can see where the two bones come in contact with one another. So what Mr. Castaneda is spreading apart right there and showing you that smooth surface that's known as a superior articular facet. And it's always going to interact with its more superior bone, and that surface though is going to be known as the one that just above it as the inferior articular facet. Okay, so again, these are all creating joints. Again, two joints coming together, we have a superior and inferior articulating facet. To show you that on one bone by itself, we're gonna go to this vertebra here. So what we can see are these two bony landmarks here, one on either side, and these are gonna be our superior articular facets. If we take the bone and we were to flip it upside down on the undersurface, we can in turn see the inferior articular facets. So again, always the inferior articular facets are going to interact with the superior articular facets of the bone just below it. The next structure is known as the transverse process. The transverse process, transverse is most lateral. So Mr. Castaneda is holding both of those points. The most lateral points are going to be our transverse processes of any vertebra. There we go for a lumbar. There we go, as well for a cervical. And we're going to show you the differences between these here in a little bit then too. The spinous process is going to be known as the most posterior point seen on any individual vertebrae. We can see that it's a very elongated, pointed structure pointing inferiorly on this one, for instance. And then if we look at a lumbar, it's a little smaller, but still the most posterior process that we're going to see, the spinous process, the most posterior point seen on any vertebra. The body of the vertebra will be seen as the most massive anterior portion of that bone, the large solid mass. So there we go right there. Lumbar vertebra. We also go ahead and then we have a thoracic vertebra there. And we can still see that on most of these cervical vertebra. Some of them are going to be a little bit different, especially when we come to the top two, but we'll talk to that here in a second. The spinal, we also call that the vertebral canal or foramen. We'll take any combination from your checklist. But the main thing that we're seeing here is this is where we're going to find the spinal cord running through. So there we go, a spinal canal, or again, spinal foramen, large hole that runs through any of the vertebra. The last item up for bids is going to be our intervertebral foramen. Now, this is very key. We must have the bone as it being articulated to see these. Okay, so an intervertebral foramen is going to be right where we see a hole between the superior and inferior vertebra. On either side, either side, either side. Again, intervertebral foramen. If we were to ever ask you disarticulated, which we're not going to, instead that would be called a intervertebral notch. But again, omit that. We're going to stick with the foramen because that's going to be a much more specific question for you online now. Go straight into the cervical vertebra. Now we're going to be looking at the first two specifically, the atlas as well as the axis. Now the key note on your checklist is that with the atlas is going to be the most superior vertebra of our entire vertebral column, and it's not going to have a body. So no body seen on this bone, but we can still see the superior as well as the inferior articular facets. And Mr. Castaneda has his fingers on the transverse processes. So we still have those intact as well. Now the one key thing for every cervical vertebra are these two holes that we see on either side. And these are going to be known as the transverse foramen. Take note that only cervical vertebra contain transverse foramen through their transverse processes. That's very unique to all cervical vertebra, whether it's the atlas, axis, or any of the rest of the other 5 cervical vertebra. Now let's go ahead and move to the bone that's just below that. So we had the atlas. The atlas sits on top, kind of like the world. And the atlas has to have an axis in order for it to turn. Well, if we look at this bone here, we have the axis. The axis has one key point as part of its body, and that's going to be known as, in our checklist, the dens. I like to keep it simple. You can just call that the dens. You can call it the odontoid process if you choose to. I like dens, real easy to remember with that one. We can still see those transverse foramen. Beautiful. And then we can see them combined as one unit. So there we go. We can see the superior articulating facets of the axis interacting with the inferior articulating facets of the atlas, and that allows us to say, no, swivel our head back and forth. If we want to go ahead and look at just a general cervical vertebra, we can still see the transverse processes with the transverse foramen, the body fully intact in the center, the spinal canal, the hole down the middle, and then just posterior, we have the spinous process. All as one unit. There we go. Now, well, let's move on to some other vertebra. Other vertebra are going to be our thoracic as well as our lumbar vertebra. The key thing we want to look at with our thoracic vertebra, all right, are going to be the superior articular facets. And what we're going to notice about these superior articulating facets is that they're going to sit on a coronal plane. So we can see that you could say that the articular surface is seen posteriorly. Okay, so always on that coronal plane. We can still see other points like the spinous process. We can still see those transverse processes. But again, take note, we don't have any transverse foramen anymore. Since this is a thoracic vertebra, our key feature to look at are those superior articulating facets sitting on a coronal plane. If we move on down to more vertebra, we can see a lumbar. One final structure to take a look at are going to be the rib articular facets. And we're going to see that in the most lateral portion of the transverse processes. So essentially speaking, we're going to see a rib come into contact with those thoracic vertebra at these two specific points to create joints. Moving into our lumbar vertebra. Our key feature here that we're going to look for is that the superior and inferior articulating facets are now going to be pointing on a forward, or what we could say is a sagittal plane. So they took a giant turn. They went from being coronal with our thoracic vertebra, now they're pointing forward, or again on that sagittal plane, with our lumbar vertebra. If we look still again, we can still see the body of the lumbar vertebra. We can see the spinal canal. And then we move to the lateral portion, posterior portion, I should say, spinous process. And then if we move to the most lateral 2 points, those are going to be the transverse processes. And that will cover everything for a lumbar vertebra. Just to stick with your checklist, we're going to move to the bone that's going to sit just below the last 5th lumbar vertebra, and that's going to be the sacrum. The sacrum is going to have some specific points that we're going to want to look at. And the first structure that we're going to look at is the superior articular facet. So if we take that bone and we disarticulate it, we can see those two most superior points. A big note here, since it's the most inferior bone of the entire spinal column, there will be no inferior articular facets. There are only 2 superior articular facets. The next structure to look at on your checklist is going to be the sacroiliac articular surface. I know that's a mouthful, but just put it all together. Sacroiliac articular surface. It's going to be creating a joint with the ilium, which we'll get to later as part of the pelvic bone, and then interacting directly with the sacrum here. So sacroiliac articular surface, the most lateral portion of the sacrum. Here we go, we can see actually the ilium directly interacting with that sacrum, creating that joint, the sacroiliac articular surface. The next item on your checklist is going to be the medial or median sacral crest. The median sacral crest is going to be along the posterior midline of this bone. And we can see it as a sharp edge along the entire posterior and running completely inferior along the entire bone's edge. Again, most posterior, the median sacral crest. And the final structures to look just lateral to are going to be the sacral foramen, holes within the sacrum, sacral foramen. Final structure to note of for the vertebral column is the coccyx. The coccyx can be made up of anywhere from 3 to 5 bones, and in this case, we can see 4 bones fused together, creating the coccyx, the most inferior portion of the entire vertebral column. All right, welcome back, folks. We're going to go ahead and cover Roman numeral 3 on your checklist, page 20, the thorax. This is going to continue with the ribs, the sternum, the body of that sternum and other separate portions, as well as the xiphoid process. Now, go ahead and look at your checklist. We want to start with letter A, the ribs. There are going to be several sets of ribs that we're going to look at. We're going to be looking at number 1, the true ribs. Now, what the word true ribs means is that these are truly attaching to the sternum, versus other ribs, false ribs. These ribs won't truly be attaching to the sternum. Some of them will be attaching to the sternum via cartilage. And then we'll have some that are just considered free-floating, not attaching at all to the most anterior portion, being the sternum. Let's break that down, though. The first 7 pairs are called true ribs. Now, true ribs, if we want to go ahead and take a look, here's a single true rib sitting all by itself, right? Very unique structure, a rib. And if we want to look at the rib close up, okay, we could see some of those articulating processes that sit right into those rib articulating facets of those thoracic vertebrae. To see a close-up look at that, you can go ahead and look here, and right there where they're meeting the bones, right there with the thoracic vertebra, we can see that point intact being those rib articulating facets. So true ribs, 7 true. Let's go ahead and count those out. We're going to want to start with the first one that we see. Just underneath the clavicle here, we have the first rib, second rib, third rib, fourth rib, fifth rib, sixth rib, and seventh rib. They all have true cartilage attaching directly to the sternum itself with all those 7 true pairs of ribs. Right? Now, if we continue to move downward, we have the false ribs. Those are going to be ribs numbers 8, 9, and 10 for the vertebral chondral. Now, the word vertebral chondral means that they're attaching to the sternum via cartilage. And if we go ahead and count those out, we'll start at most inferior just to help you out here. 10, 9, and 8. So ribs 8, 9, and 10, these are false ribs, but to be even more specific with these pairs, these are called vertebral chondral ribs, attaching to the sternum via cartilage, the same piece of cartilage that allows the 7th rib to truly attach to the sternum. If we move down a little bit farther, we can go ahead and zoom in a little bit here, and we see 2 final ribs. These are our vertebral floating ribs, ribs number 11 and 12. So if we said, name the specific rib, the answer to this question would be the 12th floating rib. If we were to ask you a question, name this specific rib, this would be the 2nd true rib. Your checklist goes to letter B, sternum. The sternum is our most central anterior bone that we're going to see right through here. The sternum is made up of 2 specific portions. The first portion is going to be this most superior portion, known as the manubrium. Now, if I look really closely, I can almost see it. It almost looks like a cow head right here. Manubrium. Kind of a silly way to think of it, but easy to remember that way, manubrium. And then we have this thing called the sternal angle, which you can go ahead and omit from your checklist. Okay, sternal angle, go ahead and omit. But what we want to see is some specific portions of this manubrium. The first thing that we want to look at is the jugular notch. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to look at this most superior indentation. Right where I stick my finger here is going to be that median suprasternal, or I like to keep it simple, jugular notch of the manubrium. And if we look now to the more lateral portion where the clavicle comes into play, creating a joint with the manubrium, and this little joint right here, this little notch right here that we see, these are going to be called the clavicular notches, one on either side. So jugular notch, just move laterally, and we have the clavicular notch of the manubrium. Let's move below that sternal angle that I said to omit, and now we can just singularly see the body of the sternum. The body of the sternum is where we're going to see ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 attaching. Okay. The key thing that we need to know about the body is that the lateral portions, where the cartilage comes into play with those true ribs, these are going to be called the costal notches. Costal notch, costal notch, costal notches. Now, if we just simply slide down to the most inferior portion, you can go ahead and feel this on your chest. This most inferior point, the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is the most inferior point of the sternum.